Interesting new information tonight about why the U.S. government has shut down 19 embassies across Africa and the Middle East and extended those closings of those embassies all the way through this week. They're saying those 19 embassies will not be open until the weekend at the earliest now. The New York Times says tonight that the reason all the embassies got shut down was the intercept of a direct communication of some kind between this guy, Ayman al-Zawahiri, the head of al-Qaeda, and this guy, who is the head of al-Qaeda in Yemen. That, of course, is the most active and most people think the most dangerous chapter of al-Qaeda now. The U.S. government intercepted a communication, apparently, about some attack or attacks that were apparently timed to right now by intercepting a communication between these two men. It's interesting, though. On Friday night, the New York Times had posted an article saying that there had been an intercept of something related to al-Qaeda that caused the embassy closings, but they were not specific about the fact that it was the top guy, the one household name al-Qaeda terrorist left in the world, right? The Times did not say on Friday that it was Zawahiri, the top guy, who was one of the people who was in this conversation that was intercepted. The Times apparently knew that on Friday night when they posted their story, but they did not include that detail in the story. Quote, in an article posted on the web on Friday and published on Saturday, the identities of the al-Qaeda leaders whose conversations were intercepted were withheld by the New York Times at the request of senior American intelligence officials. So the Times reporters knew, but they didn't say in the article because the government asked them not to say. Then on Sunday, reporters from McClatchy wrote about the same intercept and the same threat, and they went ahead and printed the guys' names. Quote, after the government became aware of this article, the McClatchy article, the government dropped its objections to the Times publishing the same information. It is kind of ridiculous that everything we know about national security we know because of leaks. That is the way our government communicates with us about counterterrorism and national security issues broadly, even just law enforcement to a certain extent. It's anonymous sources titrating information carefully to reporters in a way that is half managed and half chaos, and nothing is ever official. And you can see the way they're sort of trying to balance their strategy here. And the embassy's all being closed, now being closed for a long time, that's a big deal. You want people to know that this big deal thing that you have done is justified. So it's helpful to be able to say something other than, oh, vaguely, we have national security concerns, so we're shutting down the embassies. We're worried about some threat that we're not going to talk about. That's still the official line, right? It is helpful to be able to say that actually what this is an intercept of al-Qaeda's top leadership talking to each other directly about an imminent attack at a specific time. That said, you do not necessarily want the newspapers to print that the exact intercept you got was between guy named A and guy named B, because then you are telling those specific guys in the pages of the Miami Herald or the pages of the New York Times that whatever means they were using to communicate with each other, that they felt was safe enough to use to have that conversation, is not actually safe enough. They should not use that communication anymore because the U.S. government can listen into that. They might have thought it was safe, but it's not. So for U.S. intelligence purposes, whatever means they used to communicate, those two al-Qaeda guys, that may have been a very valuable source of information for the United States. Valuable enough to have produced this threat warning and to have shut down all these embassies. But now, that source of information has been disclosed to the people who were using it. And so as an information source, as an intelligence source, because of this leak, it is gone. And of course, the other side of this is that it's all political. What we're talking about are the surveillance powers of the United States government. And right now, there are heightened domestic political considerations around those issues, more than there used to be, thanks to Edward Snowden. And if you think about it, if you want people and politicians to feel better about the immense surveillance power of the United States government, then say what it's for. It's helpful to show whenever you can that what we're using this power for is stopping specific plots by al-Qaeda guys that you can name. Right? When you're just talking in the abstract about the power of the government to spy, that power is less appealing in the abstract than when you think about the government deploying such a power against bad guys. Sounds great if it's for catching terrorists. That change in feeling about the government's power, depending on what the government is using that power for, that change in our feeling about these government powers is a quantifiably observable thing. Look at this. This is just from a couple of weeks ago. This is fascinating. Pew Research Center surveyed Americans and asked them this question: do you favor the government collecting metadata from all communications in the United States? And the answer pretty much is no. Americans are not into that. Only 21% of people favor that idea. But then if you ask the same people the exact same question again, do you favor the government collecting metadata from all the communications in the U.S., and then you add this, as part of anti-terrorism efforts, oh, well, when you put it that way, yes. Yeah, that doesn't sound like such a bad idea. Support for the exact same activity by the U.S. government jumps by 17 points. When you ask the exact same question about the exact same behavior by the exact same government, but you just mention terrorism in the same sentence, you get a 17-point jump in support. That was true when they asked about metadata. It was also true when they asked about the government actually listening in to your phone calls and reading your emails. This was the question. Look, do you favor the government taking not just the metadata, but the actual recordings, the actual text of almost all communications in the United States? You ask Americans that, and they say, no, we do not like the idea of the government doing that. Only 16% of Americans say, I think that's a good idea. But if you ask exactly the same question, exactly the same, phrased exactly the same way, but then also at the end mention, it's part of anti-terrorism efforts. Just mentioning terrorism, that makes the support jump 8 points. We may not like what our government is doing, but if the government says what it's doing relates to fighting terrorism, then whatever the government's doing seems more appealing. So if the government's feeling heat for its massive secret surveillance power that we only find out through leaks and whistleblowers, politically, it can help to link the exercise of that government power, that raw capacity, to this fight that we all want the government to win against terrorists. George W. Bush encapsulated this perfectly when the whole warrantless wiretapping program was first reported by the New York Times in 2005, when he basically said, you know what, if you're not al-Qaeda, you got nothing to worry about. This sort of thing cuts the other direction too, though. What if the American people haven't much cared about, or maybe have even approved of something the government was doing because we thought it was for fighting terrorism, but instead it's not? Something that everybody's maybe a little squeamish about, but basically okay with, because it's supposedly only for use against bad guys in foreign countries, guys like this, right? Turns out instead, it's being used by local American cops for regular old crime, for stuff done by Americans that has nothing to do with wacky religious ideology or anything else. What if the immense surveillance powers of the U.S. government that had some agent somewhere listening into this conversation with the threats to the U.S. embassies, what if that same power has those same agents also listening in on your phone calls, finding out that maybe you're selling pot or something? Because it turns out they are. They are using the same stuff that they're using to track terrorists to also work on domestic crime. There's been a flurry of recent reporting, the San Francisco Chronicle, the New York Times, and most intriguingly today in Reuters, about the fact that tips derived from NSA mass surveillance are being handed over to domestic American law enforcement through agencies like the DEA for things like regular old non-terrorist American crimes committed by Americans. According to Reuters, a secretive DEA unit is funneling information from intelligence intercepts to authorities across the nation to help them launch criminal investigations of Americans. Reuters also reporting that law enforcement officials are getting trained that once they get these tips from NSA surveillance and other places, they should cover up that the information that they got came from any of those surveillance programs. They should instead pretend that they got the information through traditional legal law enforcement means. They should launder the source of the information. These guys did not get the information through traditional law enforcement means. They got it from the thing that we've all been thinking they're only using against terrorists, except they're supposed to be pretending otherwise. Eek. Joining us now is John Schiffman. He's a correspondent with Reuters News Service. It is his reporting that brought this program to light. Mr. Schiffman, thank you very much for being with us tonight.
Thanks for having me.
So how does the DEA, a domestic law enforcement agency in this, operating in this context, have access to this information that is only supposed to be about foreigners? How does this work?
Well, there are 4 ways that the Special Operations Division, which is a unit of DEA, gets this information. The first way they get it is through passed along NSA intercepts. The second way they get it is from regular informants. The third way they get it is from a large database of telephone and internet data collected inside the United States. And the fourth way is through wiretaps from one investigation and applying it to the next investigation. And what they do is they pass these tips along to agents in the field. When the agents or police make arrests, say a traffic stop, they'll pull somebody over for speeding or for a taillight that's out on a pretext. And then after the person is arrested, they won't tell them the true reason why they were pulled over, what the original source of the investigation was.
If that is, I recognize that that's not unique to this Special Operations Division of the DEA, as you documented in your reporting for Reuters, that law enforcement sometimes does this to essentially launder the original source of what leads to a prosecution. But in that case, how can a person fully defend themselves if they're not able to follow the information and the accusations against them to their source?
Well, law enforcement has a term for this. They call it, quote, parallel construction. And it is designed to hide the evidence. And the problem is not so much the probable cause and why someone might have been pulled over. The problem occurs if the case goes to trial and a defendant has a right to see that evidence in pretrial discovery that's against them, any evidence against them at trial. And they may not know about potential exculpatory evidence that might show innocence, that might show excuse, that might show entrapment, might show any number of reasons why they ought to be able to put up a decent defense.
Is it clear to you in your reporting on this that when this information is coming to the DEA from NSA intercepts, that these NSA intercepts are things that only incidentally captured Americans' behavior and American conversations? Is it clear that this has to be stuff that was targeting foreign communications and people in other countries in the first place, and that NSA stumbled upon it by accident?
Well, from the people that we've spoken with, that appears to be the case. You can never tell. Agents tell us that there's no way you can ever truly know if you're listening to an intercept or even an email whether the person's an American citizen. I mean, sometimes there isn't time, there isn't enough information to know. So there's really not necessarily no way to know. They've been doing this since the mid-'90s, late '90s. They've been collecting this information and used it in a lot of different cases.
At one point in your report, you say that the Special Operations Division of the DEA is still a very highly classified part of that agency. Its precise location not being revealed, its budget being secret. How did you arrive at this estimate that this division has a $125 million budget if that number is not public? That seemed like a sort of intriguing thing that you ferreted out.
Well, it's interesting because usually one of the most basic things besides spelling somebody's name correctly, if you're a reporter, is to ask how many employees do you have and what's your budget. And when I went out to visit, they declined to say. And just did a Google search of Special Operations Division, DEA, which, by the way, is very well known for its work in all sorts of international drug cases and in coordinating other cases. The SOD isn't a secret, but this work that we wrote about certainly is. So I just did a Google search, and someone who works, a senior person in SOD, had it posted on their LinkedIn site, on their LinkedIn posting. I
work at an agency that has a $125 million budget?
Yes.
Wow, smooth move.
And have 300 employees.
Nice. John Schiffman, correspondent with Reuters. Thank you for your reporting. Thanks for explaining it to us tonight. I appreciate your time.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks. All right.